22,000 years ago, at the height of the last glacial maximum, a group of humans who had survived temperatures that would kill modern humans. Humans in minutes suddenly abandoned their thriving settlement, not because of the cold, not because of predators, but because of something that left no physical trace, yet drove entire populations to flee territories they had occupied for generations. What we found in their caves would challenge everything we thought we knew about human psychological evolution. Part 1. The Survivors. Ice Age humans were masters of the impossible. They tracked mammoth herds across frozen wastelands, where a single misstep meant death. They crafted clothing so sophisticated that modern survival experts struggle to replicate it. They developed hunting strategies that turned them from prey into the most efficient predators on Earth. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe and Asia shows thriving communities during periods when temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. These weren't just survivors, they were innovators. They created the first musical instruments, carved intricate art from mammoth ivory, and developed complex social structures that allowed them to thrive in conditions that would destroy modern humans within hours. Their technological achievements were staggering. They invented the spear thrower, a device that increased throwing distance and force by over 200%. They created needles from bones so fine they rival modern steel needles. They developed waterproof clothing using intestinal membranes and tree resins. They built shelters from mammoth bones that could house entire extended families and withstand winds that would flatten modern tents. They created portable art, carrying carved figures thousands of miles, suggesting complex trade networks and cultural exchange across vast distances. Dr. Sarah Chen, a paleoanthropologist from Cambridge University, explains that Ice Age humans possess cognitive abilities that matched or exceeded our own. Their brain capacity was actually slightly larger than modern humans. They solved problems we can barely imagine. How to preserve meat for months without refrigeration, how to navigate vast distances without landmarks, how to predict weather patterns that could kill. They mastered fire to such a degree that some groups maintained continuous flames for decades, passing embers from generation to generation like sacred relics. They understood animal behavior so intimately that they could predict migration patterns years in advance. They developed calendars based on lunar cycles, tracked seasons through star positions, and created the first maps using symbols carved into bone and stone. Yet despite all these achievements, despite conquering challenges that seem superhuman to us today, something made them afraid. Something made them run. Part 2. The First Signs. The evidence began emerging in the 1990s when researchers started noticing patterns in cave art that didn't match the typical hunting scenes and animal portraits. Deep in caves across France and Spain, in chambers that required crawling through narrow passages in complete darkness, they found something disturbing. Abstract symbols that appeared nowhere else. Handprints made by people who had deliberately broken their own fingers. Scratches on walls that forensic analysis revealed were made by human fingernails, not tools. These weren't expressions of art or ritual. They were manifestations of terror. The locations of these markings were significant. They appeared in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of caves, places where people would only go if driven by desperation. Some chambers could only be reached by squeezing through passages so narrow that clothing had to be removed. Others required dangerous climbs or crossing underground streams. The effort and risk involved in reaching these spaces suggested that people weren't going there by choice. They were hiding. Migration patterns told an even stranger story. Groups would suddenly abandon camps that showed no signs of attack, starvation, or environmental threat. Food stores were left full. Tools remained in perfect condition. Fire pits showed they had been deliberately extinguished, not allowed to die naturally. The migrations themselves defied all survival logic. Groups moved away from known water sources, away from established hunting grounds, away from shelter. They moved toward danger, toward unknown territories where death was far more likely. But death from predators or cold was apparently preferable to whatever they were fleeing. Analysis of these abandoned sites revealed disturbing details. Personal items were often arranged in patterns that suggested hasty ritual activity. Valuable tools were sometimes deliberately broken. Food was scattered in ways that indicated not carelessness, but intentional waste. Most puzzling were the small objects, children's toys, jewelry, personal talismans, that were carefully hidden rather than taken or abandoned. It was as if people expected to return, but never did. One site in Central Europe revealed the most puzzling evidence yet. A thriving community of over 200 individuals with sophisticated shelters and abundant resources was abandoned in what archaeologists estimate was less than a single day. Personal items were left behind. Clothing, tools, even children's toys remained exactly where they had been dropped. But there were no bodies, no signs of violence, no indication of what had caused an entire community to flee. Until researchers looked more carefully at the last artwork created before the abandonment. The images showed human figures, but distorted, with features that suggested fear or horror. Not fear of animals or natural disasters, but fear of other humans, or perhaps fear of themselves. Part 3. The Darkness Within. What Ice Age humans discovered, perhaps for the first time in human history, was that the greatest threats didn't always come from outside. They came from within their own minds. Dr. James Morrison from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology has spent decades studying the emergence of human consciousness. He believes that Ice Age humans were the first to experience what we now recognize as clinical depression, anxiety disorders, and PTSD. The very intelligence that allowed them to survive also cursed them with awareness of their own mortality and the ability to imagine threats that didn't physically exist. The evidence is written in their bones. Skeletal remains from this period show stress markers consistent with chronic anxiety. Tooth enamel analysis reveals periods of severe malnutrition even when food was available, suggesting eating disorders or food-related anxiety. Burial practices changed dramatically, with some groups beginning to bury their dead far from living areas, while others kept bodies close in what appears to be an inability to let go. These weren't responses to physical threats. They were responses to psychological ones. The physical effects of chronic stress are visible in the archaeological record. Bone density decreased even in young adults. Growth patterns in children show interruptions that correspond not to food shortages, but to periods of extreme stress. Dental records reveal grinding patterns consistent with chronic anxiety. Joint wear suggests repetitive behaviors that serve no practical purpose, possibly early forms of obsessive-compulsive behaviors developed as coping mechanisms. The isolation of small groups during long winters created perfect conditions for what we now call cabin fever or isolation psychosis. Groups of 20 to 50 people trapped together for months in darkness with no escape from each other's company. The same faces, the same voices, the same conflicts, amplified by the knowledge that leaving meant certain death. Modern studies of isolated communities show that even with all our entertainment and distractions, small groups can develop shared delusions, paranoid thoughts, and violent impulses within weeks. Ice Age humans endured this for months at a time, year after year. The psychological pressure of constant proximity created new forms of social stress. Every movement was observed, every word remembered, every mistake magnified. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space was a luxury no one could afford. The smallest irritations, a snoring sleeper, a crying child, someone's eating habits became sources of rage that had to be suppressed because conflict could destroy the group. This emotional pressure cooker created conditions where psychological breakdown wasn't just possible, but inevitable. The darkness itself became a living thing in their minds. Without artificial light beyond small fires, they spent up to 18 hours a day in complete blackness during winter months. The human brain, deprived of visual stimulation, begins to create its own. Hallucinations, both visual and auditory, would have been common. Shared hallucinations, where entire groups experience the same visions, are documented in modern isolated communities. For Ice Age humans, these experiences would have been indistinguishable from reality. The darkness populated itself with threats that existed only in their minds, but were as real as any predator to those who experienced them. Part 4. The Social Predator. But perhaps the most terrifying discovery was that humans could be as dangerous as any saber-toothed cat. Not through physical violence, though that certainly existed, but through something far more insidious: social manipulation and psychological warfare. Dr. Elena Vasquez from Harvard has studied the emergence of complex social dynamics in prehistoric communities. She's found evidence of sophisticated ostracism rituals, scapegoating practices, and what appears to be the first instances of gaslighting in human history. The evidence comes from burial sites where certain individuals were interred in ways that suggest social punishment. Bodies placed face down, bound even in death, buried outside community boundaries. But these individuals showed no signs of physical violence. They had died of natural causes, yet were treated as threats even after death. Other sites show evidence of individuals who were systematically excluded from group activities. Their living spaces were separated, their tools were of inferior quality, their food remains suggest they received smaller or less desirable portions. The mechanisms of social control were subtle but effective: whispering campaigns that gradually isolated individuals, selective sharing of resources that created hierarchies of dependence, ritualized humiliation disguised as humor or tradition, the creation of in-groups and out-groups within communities that should have been united for survival. These dynamics created environments where social death preceded physical death, where being cast out psychologically was often a prelude to being cast out literally. The real horror came from what anthropologists call social cannibalism. Not the consumption of human flesh, though that did occur during extreme famines, but the psychological consumption of individuals by the group. When things went wrong, when hunts failed or children died or storms lasted too long, someone had to be blamed. The group would slowly turn on one member, attributing every misfortune to their presence. The psychological pressure was devastating. We see evidence of individuals who simply walked away into certain death rather than endure continued social torture. This dynamic created a new kind of fear that had never existed before in human evolution: the fear of your own people. Every social interaction became charged with danger. Say the wrong thing, look at someone the wrong way, fail to contribute enough to a hunt, and you could become the next target. The very cooperation that allowed humans to survive also became a weapon that could be turned against any member of the group at any time. Trust, the foundation of human society, became a luxury that could cost you everything. Part 5. The memory disease. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that trauma could be passed from one generation to the next without anyone understanding how or why. Dr. Michael Reeves from Oxford University has pioneered research into transgenerational trauma in prehistoric populations. Using new techniques in ancient DNA analysis, his team has found epigenetic markers suggesting that children of Ice Age humans carried the biological imprint of their parents' psychological trauma. This meant that fears could persist in communities long after the original threat had passed. A group that had experienced starvation might continue hoarding behavior for generations, even when food was plentiful. Communities that had lost members to accidents in specific locations would avoid those areas for centuries, passing down the fear through stories and unconscious behaviors. The fear became embedded in their culture, their rituals, their very DNA. The mechanisms of this transmission were both biological and cultural. Stress hormones in pregnant mothers affected fetal development, priming children for threats they had never experienced. Parenting behaviors shaped by trauma created anxious attachment patterns that persisted through generations. Stories told to warn became stories that traumatized, creating fear of things that no longer existed or had never existed in the first place. We see this in the archaeological record through mysterious taboos. Certain animals that were perfectly good food sources were never hunted by specific groups. Certain areas rich in resources were left untouched. Certain times of year triggered mass migrations, even when conditions were favorable. These weren't rational responses to current threats. They were inherited fears, traumatic memories encoded into the cultural genome of entire populations. The phantom threat response became a defining characteristic of Ice Age human behavior. Groups would react to dangers that existed only in collective memory. They would prepare for attacks that never came, flee from enemies that had been dead for generations, avoid foods that had made someone sick decades ago. The survival advantage of remembering threats had become a psychological prison, trapping communities in cycles of fear that no longer served any purpose. These inherited fears shaped migration patterns, settlement choices, and social structures in ways that often decreased rather than increased survival chances. Part 6. The Mind Hunters. As human social complexity increased, a new type of predator emerged, those who had learned to hunt minds instead of bodies. Dr. Patricia Wong from MIT has studied the emergence of manipulative behavior in early human societies. She's found evidence of individuals who gain power not through physical strength or hunting ability, but through psychological control of others. These early manipulators left traces in the archaeological record, burial sites where one individual was interred with far more goods than their skeletal remains would suggest they could have earned through physical labor. Living spaces that showed one person controlled resources without contributing to their acquisition. Most tellingly, changes in community structure that coincided with the rise of specific individuals, followed by sudden collapses when those individuals died. The techniques they used were sophisticated, creating artificial scarcity to increase dependence, spreading fear of external threats to maintain group cohesion under their leadership, isolating potential rivals through whisper campaigns and social manipulation, using ritual and superstition to create hierarchies that place them at the top. These weren't shamans or healers serving their communities. They were predators who had discovered that human minds could be trapped as surely as any animal in a snare. Their methods included what we now recognize as classic manipulation tactics: love bombing followed by withdrawal of affection, creating double binds where any choice led to punishment, gaslighting that made victims doubt their own perceptions, triangulation that turned community members against each other. These techniques were so effective that they could control entire groups without ever resorting to physical violence. The fear they created was unlike anything humans had experienced before. You couldn't run from it because it existed in your own thoughts. You couldn't fight it because the enemy was invisible. You couldn't even be sure it was real because the manipulation was designed to make you doubt your own perceptions. Communities began developing protective rituals, not against spirits or predators, but against the manipulative members of their own groups. But these defenses were often ineffective against those who had mastered the art of psychological control. Part 7. The Great Awakening. But humans are nothing if not adaptable. Faced with these new psychological threats, Ice Age humans developed the first forms of mental health treatment. Dr. Robert Kim from Yale has studied the emergence of therapeutic practices in prehistoric societies. He's found evidence that music, art, and storytelling evolved not just as entertainment, but as ways to process trauma and maintain psychological health. The bone flutes found in caves weren't just musical instruments. They were tools for emotional regulation. The rhythmic breathing required to play them is identical to modern anxiety reduction techniques. The cave paintings weren't just art. They were a form of exposure therapy, allowing people to face their fears in symbolic form. The stories told around fires weren't just entertainment. They were ways of processing collective trauma and passing on coping strategies. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities developed specific roles for mental health support. Certain individuals identified by unique burial goods and living arrangements appear to have served as what we would now call counselors or therapists. They were positioned centrally in communities but maintained some separation, suggesting they served all members while avoiding taking sides in conflicts. Their tools included not just herbs and rituals, but techniques for guided visualization, dream interpretation, and conflict resolution. Shamanic practices emerged not to commune with spirits, but to guide people through psychological crises. The shamanic journey, induced through drumming, dancing, or plant medicines, allowed individuals to confront their fears in a controlled setting. The shaman served as what we would now call a therapist, helping people integrate traumatic experiences and develop resilience. The rhythmic drumming used in these practices matches frequencies known to induce therapeutic trance states. Communities develop social structures designed to prevent psychological breakdown. Rotation of duties to prevent isolation. Communal storytelling to process shared experiences. Rituals that reinforced belonging and reduced social anxiety. Games and competitions that allowed for controlled conflict resolution. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated mental health interventions that we're only now beginning to understand and appreciate. They created sacred spaces where normal social rules were suspended, allowing for emotional release and psychological reset. Part 8. The Modern Echo. The fears that plagued Ice Age humans haven't disappeared. They've simply taken new forms. Dr. Lisa Anderson from Stanford has spent years studying the connection between ancient fears and modern anxiety disorders. She's found that many of our most common mental health challenges are direct descendants of Ice Age psychological adaptations. Social media anxiety is the modern version of Ice Age social surveillance. The fear of missing out echoes ancient fears of being excluded from the group. Imposter syndrome reflects the deadly consequences of not contributing enough to community survival. Panic attacks mirror the fight-or-flight responses that kept our ancestors alive but now fire in response to psychological rather than physical threats. Our nervous systems, evolved for small group dynamics, struggle with the constant social exposure of modern life. The constant connectivity of modern life creates isolation paradoxes, similar to those faced by Ice Age humans. We're surrounded by people but feel alone. We have unlimited entertainment but suffer from boredom. We have access to more resources than ever, but feel scarcity. Our brains, evolved for small group dynamics and immediate physical threats, struggle to process the abstract dangers and social complexities of modern life. The 24-hour news cycle triggers the same vigilance that once watched for predators, but the threats never materialize, leaving us in a constant state of alert. Modern workplace dynamics often recreate Ice Age social hierarchies. Office politics mirror the subtle manipulations of prehistoric power struggles. Workplace bullying follows patterns established around Ice Age fires. The fear of job loss triggers the same responses as fear of exile from the group. Performance reviews echo the constant evaluation that determined who ate and who starved. We've replaced physical survival with economic survival, but our brains respond with the same ancient programs. But we also carry within us the solutions our ancestors developed. The urge to create art when we're troubled, the need to share stories to process trauma, the impulse to gather in groups for mutual support, the development of rituals and routines to manage anxiety. These aren't just cultural habits. They're survival strategies encoded in our genes by thousands of generations who faced the darkness within and found ways to kindle light. Modern therapy often rediscovers techniques our ancestors knew intuitively. The power of rhythm, movement, creative expression, and human connection to heal psychological wounds. The Ice Age survivors who fled from invisible terrors weren't weak. They were the first humans to recognize that the greatest threats to our species might come from within our own minds. Their courage in facing these psychological demons gave us art, music, spirituality, and the understanding that mental health is just as crucial as physical survival. We carry their fears, but also their solutions, encoded in every aspect of human culture. The lesson from those abandoned settlements isn't that they failed, it's that they survived long enough to pass on both their traumas and their triumphs to us. In every moment of modern anxiety, in every creative act, in every time we reach out for human connection, we're echoing strategies developed around Ice Age fires by people who discovered that the most dangerous predator wasn't in the forest, it was in the mirror. And they found ways to tame it, one story, one song, one shared moment at a time.